The hiss of steam was a dying serpent's breath against the vast, cold silence of the plains. Under a sky pricked with distant, unfeeling stars, the iron horse slowed its gallop, its rhythmic clatter softening to a weary groan as it approached the water tower. This wasn't a town, not even a proper station, just a skeletal wooden structure and a pile of cut timber beside the tracks. A lonely outpost in the middle of nowhere. For the girl, it was a miracle. She ran from the deep shadows of the cottonwoods, a ghost of a thing in a faded calico dress, torn at the hem from snags on brush and wire. Her feet, shod in worn-out boots that were a size too big, barely made a sound on the packed dirt. All she was in the world was contained in the small cloth sack clutched in one hand, its contents so meager it barely swung with her desperate stride. In her other hand, she held the long, thick braid of honey-blonde hair that had come loose from its tie, pressing it against her chest like a lifeline. Fear was a living thing in her throat, a metallic taste on her tongue. The sounds of pursuit hoofbeats and coarse laughter were gone, faded into the night some miles back, but they echoed in her mind, louder than the chugging of the locomotive. They were not gone, just delayed. They would be searching. The train hadn't come to a full stop, its great wheels still turning with agonizing slowness. She didn't wait. With a final, lung-searing burst of speed, she reached the last car, a simple freight carrier with its side door slid partially open. Her fingers, numb with cold and slick with sweat, fumbled for a handhold. The wood was rough, splintered, and for a terrifying second, her grip slipped. The train tugged, threatening to leave her behind in the suffocating darkness. With a sob that was more animal than human, she tried again, her nails digging into the wood, her whole body straining. She found purchase, swung her legs up, and tumbled onto the hard, splintered floor of the car, landing in a heap of frayed cotton and trembling limbs. For a long moment, she just lay there, her chest heaving, drawing in greedy lungfuls of air thick with the smell of coal smoke, dust, and something else, the faint, dry scent of hay. The train picked up speed again, the click-clack of the wheels a steadying rhythm against the frantic drumming of her heart. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself up, her joints aching a protest. Her gaze swept the cavernous, moon-striped dark of the freight car. It was mostly empty, save for a few stray bales of hay and some discarded canvas tarps. And him. He was sitting on a bale in the far corner, a place where the shadows were deepest. She hadn't seen him at first. He was as still as the landscape outside, a part of the darkness itself. He was a big man, even sitting down, slumped slightly forward with his forearms resting on his knees. His presence filled the space. Broad shoulders strained the fabric of a heavy, dusty coat that had seen years of hard wear. A low-brimmed hat cast his face in complete shadow, obscuring everything but the dark bristle of a beard along a square jaw. He held no lantern. He made no sound. He just sat, a mountain of a man, watching the slivers of moonlit prairie slide by through the open door. The girl froze, her breath catching in her throat. She had traded one danger for another. The men behind her were a known evil. This man, this silent giant in the dark, was an unknown quantity, a drifter, an outlaw. Her mind, already frayed with exhaustion and terror, spun with possibilities, each one worse than the last. She pressed herself back against the wall of the car, trying to make herself smaller, to melt into the wood grain. She willed her breathing to quiet, her trembling to cease. Maybe he hadn't noticed her. Maybe he would ignore her. The train swayed, and a stray beam of moonlight cut across the car, illuminating him for a brief instant. He didn't move a muscle, but she saw the glint of his eyes under the hat's brim. They were fixed on her, not with malice, not with curiosity, but with a flat, unreadable stillness. He had known she was there the entire time. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Outside, the whistle blew, A long, lonely cry that echoed the desolation in her own heart. She knew she couldn't stay where she was. When the train next stopped, the men chasing her might be there waiting. They knew the rail lines. They knew where to look. She needed to be invisible. An idea, born of pure desperation, flickered in her mind. It was insane. It was forward and dangerous. But it was the only thing she could think of. Her eyes fixed on the greatcoat the man wore. It was vast, a shelter of worn wool and leather. Taking a breath that felt like swallowing broken glass, she pushed off the wall. She moved slowly, one shuffling step at a time. Her bare hands held out slightly, as if to show she meant no harm. She was a stray dog approaching a campfire, expecting at any moment to be met with a kick or a curse. The man didn't move. His head didn't turn. Only his eyes followed her. Two dark points in the shadows. She stopped a few feet from him, her small frame dwarfed by his. She could smell him now, the scent of clean sweat, horsehide, and the cold night air clinging to his clothes. He smelled of the earth. She had to force the words past the knot of fear in her throat. They came out as a ragged, trembling whisper, barely audible above the rumble of the wheels. "Sir." He remained silent. His stillness was unnerving, a heavy weight in the air. She tried again, her voice cracking. "Sir, could I—" She faltered, the audacity of her request seeming immense. She swallowed hard, her eyes pleading with the shadows that hid his face. "Could I hide under your coat?" The question hung in the air between them. It was a plea for more than just concealment. It was a plea for sanctuary, for a moment's peace from a world that had offered her none. She expected him to laugh, to tell her to get lost, or worse. She expected a gruff refusal, a shove, a sign that she had trespassed on a dangerous man's solitude. Boone Ledger heard the words, faint as a moth's wing against the train's clamor. He had seen her spill into his car, a tangle of limbs and desperation. He had seen the terror in the brief flash of moonlight, the wild, hunted look in eyes that were too old for her young face. He had seen the way she clutched that braid of hair as if it were the last good thing she had left. He was a man who preferred the company of his own thoughts and the wide-open spaces where questions weren't asked. He wasn't given to charity, and he had learned long ago that trouble often came in small packages. This girl was nothing but trouble. He should have said no. He should have grunted and turned his head, leaving her to her own fate. That was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But he didn't. He didn't speak. He didn't nod. Words were clumsy tools he rarely used when a simple action would do. Instead, with a slow, deliberate movement that was surprisingly fluid for a man his size, he lifted his left arm, holding the heavy wool of his greatcoat open. It was a simple gesture, but in the rattling darkness of the freight car, it was everything. He created a space, a pocket of deeper darkness, an invitation into the shelter of his own solitude. The girl's breath hitched in a small, sharp gasp of disbelief. For a second, she remained rooted to the spot, unsure if she had understood. Then, before he could change his mind, she scrambled forward on her knees. She slipped into the space he had made, moving with the quick, furtive grace of a creature seeking its burrow. The moment the heavy fabric fell, enclosing her, the world outside disappeared. The slivers of moonlight, the sight of the rushing prairie, the vast and terrifying emptiness of the car, all of it vanished. Her world shrank to the small, dark space she now occupied. It was warm. The retained heat of his body was a startling comfort against the chill that had settled deep in her bones. The smells of leather and dust were stronger here, mingling with the faint, clean scent of the man himself. She tucked herself into a ball, her back pressing against the hard wall of the car, her side nestled against the solid warmth of his torso. Through the layers of his shirt and her own thin dress, she could feel the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart, a slow and powerful drum that seemed to counter the frantic fluttering in her own chest. She drew her knees up, wrapping her arms around them, trying to take up as little space as possible. A tremor ran through her, a violent shiver born of cold, exhaustion, and the sudden, overwhelming relief of being hidden. Her shoulder, trembling uncontrollably, brushed against his back. It was a fleeting, accidental touch, skin against muscle through worn fabric, but it felt as charged as a lightning strike. It was the first human touch she had felt in days that wasn't a shove or a rough grab. It was contact without threat, proximity without menace. Boone felt the slight, shaking weight of her against him. He felt the tremor that racked her small body. He sat perfectly still, his arm falling back to his knee, the coat once again a seamless curtain of wool. He stared out into the night, his expression unchanged, his jaw set. He was a stone wall, a cliff face offering unexpected shelter from a storm. He did not acknowledge her presence with a word or a shift in his posture. He simply absorbed it, allowing her to exist in his shadow. And there, in the rattling dark of a freight car bound for an unknown destination, hidden from the world beneath a stranger's coat, something shifted. The girl's panicked breathing began to slow. The wild pounding of her heart eased, finding a new rhythm to match the steady beat beside her. She wasn't safe. Not really. The men were still out there, and the future was a terrifying, blank expanse. But for this one moment, she was concealed. She was warm. She was not alone. And though not a single word was spoken, though one was a man carved from silence and the other a girl who only knew how to run, a spark had been struck in the darkness. It was not the flash of passion, but the slow, stubborn ember of connection, lit between two strangers in the heart of the vast, unforgiving West. It was a fragile flame, but in the cold, it was enough to burn. Time inside the darkness of the coat became fluid, unmarked by the passing moon. The girl, cocooned in warmth and shadow, felt the hard edges of her terror begin to soften. Exhaustion, a foe more relentless than any man, began to claim her. Her frantic thoughts blurred, and the rhythmic rock and sway of the train became a crude lullaby. Her head drooped, her cheek coming to rest against the rough wool of the coat that covered her. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she drifted into a shallow, dreamless sleep. She was a ship finding a moment's calm in the lee of a great cliff. The storm still raging on the open sea, but, for now, held at bay. Boone felt the subtle shift in weight, the complete surrender of her body as sleep took her. A new kind of stillness settled over her, different from the frozen, watchful silence from before. He remained as he was, a living statue of patience, his gaze fixed on the passing night. He didn't know her name, didn't know the nature of the devil at her heels, and he hadn't asked. Questions were complications, and his life was complicated enough. But he knew the look of a hunted animal, and something in him, something old and deeply buried, refused to turn his back on it. He had seen that same look in the eyes of a spooked colt, cornered and trembling. You didn't answer its fear with shouts and threats. You answered with quiet, with stillness, with a simple offer of a safe space. The change in the train's rhythm woke her. It was a gradual deceleration, a groaning of metal and a long, mournful sigh from the brakes that was different from the brief pause at the water tower. This was a stop, a town. A knot of ice formed in her stomach. She was instantly awake, every nerve ending tingling with renewed dread. Through the heavy fabric, she could hear the sounds of civilization filtering in the distant bark of a dog, the faint murmur of voices. She felt Boone's body tense, a subtle tightening of the muscles in his back that was almost imperceptible. But she felt it as if it were her own. He was alert. Heavy footsteps crunched on the gravel outside the open door, followed by the thud of heavy boots landing on the wooden floor of the car. More than one, her heart, which had just found a calmer rhythm, kicked into a frantic, hammering beat against her ribs. She pressed herself tighter against Boone, trying to shrink into nothingness. She held her breath until her lungs burned. "Check this one. He said she got on the back," a voice rasped. "Rough as stones in a dry creek bed." It was a voice she knew. It belonged to a man named Silas. A cold sweat broke out across her skin. "Ain't nothing in here but some hay and dust," a second voice grumbled. "We're wasting our time." "Just look," Silas commanded, his voice sharp with impatience. Two figures appeared in the wide opening of the doorway, their forms silhouetted against the dim yellow light of the station lamps. They were big men, clad in trail-worn dusters, their holsters heavy on their hips. They stepped inside, their spurs jingling a sinister tune on the floorboards. The air in the car shifted, suddenly thick with the sour smell of whiskey and unwashed bodies, an invasive presence that suffocated the clean, earthy scent of her protector. Boone did not move. To an outside observer, he might have looked like a man deep in sleep, his head canted slightly forward, his hat brim low. But the girl, pressed against him, could feel the coiled stillness in his frame. He was not sleeping. He was a cougar waiting in the brush, utterly motionless, utterly aware. He was her only shield, a wall of flesh and bone and quiet defiance standing between her and them. One of the men, the one who had grumbled, kicked at a loose bale of hay. "See nothing." But Silas was more methodical. His eyes, accustomed to the dark, scanned the car from one end to the other. They passed over the discarded tarps, the empty corners, and then they settled on the lone figure in the corner, on Boone. The footsteps started again, slow and deliberate. Each thud of the boot on the floor was a blow against the girl's sanity. Closer, closer. A large, menacing shadow fell over them, blocking the faint light from the door. She squeezed her eyes shut, a silent prayer forming on her lips. She could feel the vibration through Boone's body as the man stopped directly in front of them. "Hey," Silas's voice was a low growl. "Too close. You wake up." Boone didn't respond. He didn't even flinch. The girl felt a nudge, a hard prod against Boone's leg, the toe of Silas's boot. I said, "Wake up. See a girl get on this train? Small thing, blonde hair." The moment stretched into an eternity. The rhythmic chuffing of the locomotive was the only sound. Then, with an unnerving slowness, Boone lifted his head. He didn't sit up straight or make any sudden move. He simply tilted his head back, just enough for his eyes to clear the shadow of his hat brim. From her hidden vantage point, the girl couldn't see his face, but she could feel the change in the air. The atmosphere in the car grew heavy, charged with a sudden, dangerous energy. Silas, who had been leaning forward with an arrogant swagger, took an involuntary step back. He had been expecting to find a sleeping drifter, a man easily intimidated. He had not been expecting the eyes that now met his. Boone's eyes were not angry. They were not frightened. They were something far more unsettling. They were flat, cold, and empty, like the surface of a frozen lake. They held a profound and weary stillness, the look of a man who had seen too much and feared too little. They made no threat, offered no challenge, but they promised a world of trouble if crossed. In their silent, unblinking gaze, Silas saw a boundary line, and he instinctively knew that stepping over it would have dire consequences. For a long second, the two men were locked in a silent battle of wills. Silas's brutish confidence wavered, cracking under the pressure of that implacable stare. He glanced at Boone's hands, resting calmly on his knees. They were large, calloused, capable hands. No weapon was visible, but the man himself seemed to be a weapon. Finally, Silas broke the gaze. He cleared his throat. A rough, uncertain sound. "Just a drifter," he muttered to his companion. The words, a poor attempt to save face. He took another step back, turning away. "Come on, she ain't here. Let's check the passenger cars again before it pulls out." The other man grunted in agreement, and their footsteps retreated. The jingle of their spurs faded. A moment later, they were gone, leaving only their foul scent lingering in the air. The girl remained frozen, barely daring to breathe. It couldn't be that simple. It couldn't be over. She listened, her ears straining, waiting for their return. But the only sound was the hiss of steam as the train prepared to depart. With a great shudder and a lurch, the wheels began to turn. A sob of pure, unadulterated relief caught in her throat. She sagged against Boone, the last of her strength draining away. The tension that had held her rigid for so long dissolved, leaving her as limp as a rag doll. She had been found. And then she had been lost again. She was safe. The train was picking up speed now, the station lights sliding away into the darkness behind them. The click-clack of the wheels grew faster, a comforting, familiar rhythm once more. They were moving, heading further away from her pursuers with every turn of the wheel. It was then that the shout cut through the night. It came from the platform they were leaving behind, a voice made thin by the growing distance but sharpened by urgency. "Silas, I saw her. A fella at the water tower saw her get on. She's on the train in the last freight car." The words struck her like a physical blow. Her blood ran cold. There was no ambiguity, no room for doubt. They knew exactly where she was. In a minute, they would get horses, or they would find a way to stop the train. The chase was not over. It had just been confirmed. Before she could even process the new wave of terror, Boone moved. The transformation was instantaneous. The mountain of stillness became a torrent of decisive action. One powerful arm wrapped around her waist, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. His other hand gripped her arm. He was on his feet in a single, fluid motion, pulling her with him toward the open door. "Hold on," he said. It was the first time he had spoken to her. His voice was not what she would have expected. It wasn't a booming command, but a low, rough baritone, like rocks grinding together deep underground. It was a voice of absolute certainty. It was not a request. It was a statement of what was about to happen. The wind roared in her ears as they reached the edge of the car. The ground outside was a dark, rushing blur. Trees and rocks streaked past in the moonlight. The speed was terrifying. To jump now was madness. It was suicide. She opened her mouth to scream, to protest, but there was no time. Boone didn't hesitate. He didn't pause to gauge the distance or look for a softer landing. He simply tightened his grip on her, pulling her body tight against his side, shielding her as much as he could. And then he jumped. For a heart-stopping second, they were airborne, suspended between the fleeting safety of the train and the unforgiving earth below. The world turned into a chaotic swirl of darkness and rushing air. Then they hit the ground. The impact was brutal. It knocked the air from her lungs in a painful gasp. They didn't land so much as crash, hitting a steep gravel embankment that sloped down from the tracks. Boone took the brunt of the fall, his large body absorbing most of the force. They tumbled end over end, a tangle of limbs and flying debris. Rocks dug into her skin, and thorny bushes tore at her dress and hair. It was a violent, jarring descent into darkness, and the only constant was the iron grip of the man who held her, his arm a steel band that refused to let go. They finally came to a stop at the bottom of the embankment, lying in a heap amidst the sagebrush and stones. Above them, the train continued on its way, its red taillights shrinking until they were just angry pinpricks in the vast darkness. The sound of its wheels faded, leaving behind in ringing, profound silence. The girl lay stunned, her body screaming with a dozen new aches and pains, her mind reeling. She was alive, bruised, battered, and stranded in the middle of the wilderness, but alive. And the silent man who had first offered her the shelter of his coat had just saved her, not with a gun or a threat, but with a simple, desperate leap into the unknown. He had jumped with her, and in doing so, had bound his fate to hers. The silence that descended after the train's departure was more profound than any noise. It was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered the world, broken only by the thin, high ringing in the girl's ears. For a long moment, she lay in the tangled heap of limbs and sagebrush, the sharp scent of crushed herbs filling her nostrils. Her mind a blank slate of shock. Every part of her body throbbed with a dull, insistent ache. Her cheek was pressed against the cold, gritty earth, a stark contrast to the fleeting warmth she had found beside the stranger. Then, a movement beside her. Boone untangled himself from their shared fall with an economy of motion that belied his size. There was no groan of pain, no curse, just a quiet grunt as he pushed himself first to his knees and then to his feet. He stood over her, a dark monolith against a sea of stars, his form blocking out a significant portion of the night sky. He looked back in the direction the train had gone, his head cocked, listening. He was listening for the one sound they both dreaded, the thunder of hoofbeats. For now, there was nothing but the whisper of the wind moving through the sparse grass. He looked down at her. She could not see his expression beneath the deep shadow of his hat, but she felt his gaze, an intense, assessing weight. He wasn't looking at her with pity or concern in the way other people might. It was the practical, appraising look of a stockman checking a foal for a broken leg. He was determining if she was a liability, if she could go on, with a resolve born of pure survival instinct. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, ignoring the sharp protest of her bruised ribs. A thin trickle of warmth ran down her arm from a long scratch on her forearm. She was a mess of tears, dirt, and blood, but she was whole. She got to her knees, her body trembling with the effort. Boone's large, calloused hand entered her field of vision. It was not offered gently. It was simply there, a solid, undeniable presence. She stared at it for a second, the wide palm, the thick fingers, the dirt ingrained in the lines of his skin. It was a hand built for work, for gripping reins and hauling timber. She placed her small, trembling hand in his, and his fingers closed around hers, not with crushing force, but with an inescapable firmness. He hauled her to her feet as if she were a sack of flour. "We move," he said, his voice the same low rumble as before. It was not a suggestion. He let go of her hand and immediately started walking, not back toward the tracks, but away from them, striking out into the open, rolling plains. She stumbled after him, her ill-fitting boots catching on stones and roots. The landscape was a terrifying, alien world painted in shades of silver and black by the moonlight. The ground was uneven, a treacherous carpet of rocks, thorny brush, and the skeletal remains of last season's wildflowers. The wind was a constant companion, a cold, searching hand that whipped her torn dress against her legs and sent strands of her loose hair flying across her face. They walked in silence, a punishing, relentless pace set by the man in front. He moved with a long, ground-eating stride, his steps sure and certain even in the deceptive light. He seemed to know this land intimately, navigating by instinct, following invisible paths through the scrub. The girl struggled to keep up, her breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. A sharp stitch developed in her side, a hot poker twisting beneath her ribs. Every muscle screamed in protest. Her only focus was the broad, dark shape of Boone's back, a moving landmark in the vast emptiness. She did not know who he was or where he was taking her, but he was moving away from the danger, and, for now, that was enough. After what felt like an hour, though it may have been only minutes, he stopped abruptly. She nearly collided with his back. He stood motionless, his head up, sniffing the air like a wolf. He was listening again, but this time his attention was focused ahead of them. The wind carried no sound of pursuit, but the danger was still there, a palpable threat that hung in the night air. He changed direction, turning sharply to the west, leading them into a section of land that was even more barren. Here, great piles of tumbleweeds, dried and brittle, were caught in the hollows and against the low, rocky outcrops. Boone stopped beside one of the largest piles, a tangled mass of dry sticks as tall as he was. He knelt, pulling a small leather pouch from his coat pocket. From it, he produced a piece of flint and a steel striker. She watched, confused, as he struck them together. A shower of sparks fell into the heart of the dry tumbleweed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a tiny orange ember glowed, pulsed, and with a sudden whoosh, the entire pile erupted in flame. The fire was hot and bright, a shocking blossom of light and heat in the cold darkness. It cast their shadows long and dancing against the rocks. But Boone wasn't building a campfire for warmth. He immediately began grabbing more dry brush and loose grass, piling it onto the blaze. He wasn't feeding it for longevity. He was feeding it for smoke. A thick, acrid cloud of gray and white smoke began to billow upwards, a greasy plume that quickly obscured the moon and stars. The wind caught it, carrying it eastward, back toward the railroad tracks, creating a dense, opaque curtain that would be visible for miles. He gave her no explanation. He didn't need to. She understood. It was a signal fire, but a false one. Anyone following their tracks from the jump site would see the smoke and assume they were there, huddled by a fire, and head in that direction. It was a clever, desperate gamble. "Now," he grunted, grabbing her arm again. He pulled her away from the fire, plunging them back into the deep darkness at the edge of its light. He led her at a near run, their path now perpendicular to their original course. They were heading south, into a series of broken, jagged hills that rose from the plains like the spine of some great, sleeping beast. The smoke bought them time, but the race was not over. The run through the hills was harder, the terrain steeper. Sharp-edged rocks threatened to turn an ankle with every step. Her lungs felt as if they were filled with fire. Her vision began to blur at the edges, dark spots dancing before her eyes. The world was reduced to the burning in her chest, the pain in her legs, and the unyielding grip of the man dragging her forward. She stumbled, her boot catching on a loose rock. Her knee hit the ground hard, and a cry of pain was torn from her throat. She fell, the strength finally deserting her. She couldn't go on. She lay on the rocky ground, gasping for air, tears of frustration and exhaustion carving clean paths through the grime on her face. "I can't," she whimpered, the words barely a sound. "I can't." Boone stopped. He stood over her, his chest heaving slightly from the exertion, the only sign that he was not made of stone. He looked down at her collapsed form on the ground. She expected him to leave her. She expected a curse, an impatient shove, a final abandonment to her fate. It was, perhaps, what she deserved for being so weak. He did none of those things. He remained silent for a long moment, allowing her the small mercy of a few precious seconds to draw air back into her tortured lungs. Then he unhooked a metal canteen from his belt. He uncapped it and knelt beside her, not with gentleness, but with a simple, practical efficiency. He pushed the canteen into her hands. "Drink," he commanded. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold it. She brought it to her lips, spilling some of the water down her chin. It was warm and tasted faintly of metal, but it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. She drank greedily, the cool liquid soothing the raw fire in her throat. When she was finished, he took the canteen, capped it, and hooked it back onto his belt. Then, once again, he took her arm and pulled her to her feet. He offered no words of encouragement, no false promises that their journey was almost over. He simply set her on her feet and started walking again, his pace slightly slower than before, a silent concession to her exhaustion. They entered a narrow ravine, a deep cut in the earth with walls of dark rock on either side. Here, they were hidden from view. The wind died down to a whisper, and the world became a quiet corridor of shadow. They followed it for what seemed like another eternity until it opened up into a small, sheltered valley. And there it was, set against the base of a low mesa, illuminated by the first pale, gray hint of impending dawn, was a homestead. It was not grand, a small, sturdy-looking cabin, built of thick, dark logs chinked with mud, stood beside a larger, more rustic barn, a simple corral, its fences straight and well-maintained, held no horses at the moment. A lone, gnarled cottonwood tree stood sentinel beside the cabin, its bare branches reaching like skeletal fingers for the fading stars. The whole place radiated a sense of quiet solitude and resilience. It was a small pocket of order carved out of the vast, chaotic wilderness. It was a place built to endure. They stopped at the edge of the yard, the hard-packed dirt a welcome relief after the treacherous ground of the hills. The running was over. She stood there, swaying on her feet, staring at the simple structures. It looked like the safest place in the entire world. Boone let go of her arm. He stood beside her, his gaze on the cabin. A different kind of stillness was on him now. The coiled, watchful tension was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of ownership, of belonging. He turned his head slightly to look at her, and in the growing light of dawn, she could finally see his face more clearly. It was a hard face, weathered by sun and wind, with lines etched at the corners of his eyes. His beard was dark and trimmed short, his jaw square and unyielding. But his eyes, which she had only seen as dark, unreadable points in the shadows, now held a deep, weary sadness. They were the eyes of a man who was intimately familiar with loss. "This is my home," he said. The words were quiet, a simple statement of fact, but they were laden with a significance that resonated deep within her. He had not just brought her to a place of safety, he had brought her to his place, his sanctuary. She looked from his tired, weathered face to the solid, peaceful cabin, and a wave of emotion so powerful it almost buckled her knees washed over her. It was gratitude, relief, and a desperate, aching hope, all rolled into one. She knew she was asking for the world, trespassing on a solitude this man clearly valued. But she had nowhere else to go. She met his gaze, her own eyes swimming with unshed tears. Her voice, when she finally found it, was a fragile, broken whisper. "Can I stay, just for one night?" He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, and her heart began to sink. She had asked for too much. Then, slowly, he gave a single, deliberate nod. It was all the answer she needed. He turned and walked toward the cabin door, his heavy boots making soft thuds in the quiet yard. He lifted the latch, and the wooden door swung inward with a low creak, opening into the welcoming darkness within. She awoke not to the familiar, heart-pounding jolt of fear, but to a profound and disorienting quiet. The world was soft. A pale, lemon-colored light filtered through a small, wavy glass window, illuminating a slow dance of dust motes in the air. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. There was no rattling of a freight car, no hard, cold ground beneath her. She was lying on a narrow cot, tucked under a heavy wool blanket that smelled faintly of wood smoke and cedar. Her body was a map of aches and bruises, each one a memory of the previous night's desperate flight and fall. But the sharp edge of terror had been dulled by the deep, dreamless sleep of pure exhaustion. Slowly, she sat up, the blanket pooling in her lap. The cabin was a single, large room, Spartan and impeccably clean. A great stone hearth, cold now but for a bed of glowing embers, dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table and two sturdy chairs stood in the center of the room. Along the far wall, shelves were neatly stocked with tins, sacks of flour and beans, and a few well-worn books. Everything had its place. There was a sense of order and stark self-sufficiency to the room, a reflection of the man who lived here. Of Boone, there was no sign, but a dented tin coffee pot sat on a trivet near the hearth's embers, radiating a gentle warmth and the rich, comforting aroma of fresh coffee. He had left it for her. The simple, unspoken gesture was as startling as it was welcome. He had given her shelter, and now he was offering sustenance. A powerful, urgent need to not be a burden propelled her from the cot. She was living on his charity, a stray he had taken in. But she would not be idle. Her bare feet were cold against the smooth, worn wood of the floorboards. She found her boots by the door where she must have left them and slipped them on. Her dress was a ruin of tears and dirt, but there was nothing to be done about that. She poured a little water from a bucket into a tin basin, washing her face and hands as best she could. The cold water was a shock, but it washed away the last vestiges of sleep and anchored her in the reality of this new, uncertain day. She stepped outside onto the porch. The morning air was crisp and thin, so clean it felt like a drink of cold water. The sun was just clearing the jagged peaks of the distant mountains, flooding the small valley with a light that made everything look sharp and new. The silence was immense, broken only by the cawing of a raven and the soft lowing of a cow from the barn. It was a peaceful, lonely sort of beauty she had not experienced in a very long time. A broom made of bound twigs was propped against the cabin wall. She took it, and with tentative, then more confident strokes, began to sweep the dust and stray leaves from the wooden planks of the porch. It was a small, simple task, but it felt important. It was an act of gratitude she could perform without words. It was a way of bringing her own small piece of order to this quiet place. As she was working, the barn door creaked open, and a small boy emerged, blinking in the bright morning sun. He looked to be about 7 or 8 years old, with a shock of unruly brown hair and wide, serious brown eyes. He was small for his age, dressed in patched but clean overalls and a faded blue shirt. In his hands, he clutched a small, crudely carved wooden horse, its surface worn smooth by constant handling. He stopped dead when he saw her, his eyes growing even wider. He looked at her, then at the cabin, then back at her, a silent question in his gaze. He clutched his wooden horse tighter, a small soldier facing an unexpected intruder in his territory. She stopped sweeping, leaning the broom against the railing. She gave him a small, hesitant smile, not wanting to frighten him. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft. The boy didn't answer right away. He just watched her, his head tilted. "You're the one he brought home," he stated, his voice clear and high. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact. She nodded. "I am." Beside the door was a wicker basket filled with freshly washed laundry, smelling of lye soap and sunshine. Seeing another task, she knelt and began to fold the rough-spun clothes. There was a man's large work shirt, a pair of canvas trousers, and then a shirt so small it seemed impossible it could belong to the giant who had saved her. It was the boy's. She folded it carefully, smoothing the worn fabric with her hands. The act was so deeply familiar, so domestic, it caused a pang in her chest. The boy, seeing that she posed no immediate threat, took a few cautious steps closer. He stopped beside the laundry basket, watching her hands as she worked. "Are you Mr. Boone's wife?" he asked, his voice full of a child's unfiltered curiosity. The question caught her by surprise. A short, rusty laugh escaped her lips before she could stop it. It felt strange in her own throat, an unfamiliar sound. It wasn't a laugh of mirth, but of a deep, sorrowful irony. A wife. That was the very thing she had been running from, the title that had been a cage, a sentence of misery. To have it asked of her now, in this place of unexpected safety, was a bitter twist. She looked at the boy's earnest, waiting face, and her smile softened, losing its sad edge. She shook her head gently. "No," she said. "No, I'm not." "Oh," he said, seeming to accept the answer without further question. He held up his wooden horse. "Mr. Boone is fixing the fence post by the creek. He told me to feed the chickens. Her name is Henrietta," he added, pointing a small, grubby finger at a particularly fat hen scratching in the dirt near the barn. "Henrietta," she repeated, the name tasting sweet on her tongue. "That's a very fine name for a chicken." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, a genuine, unforced smile touched her lips. The boy, Jesse, seemed to decide she was acceptable. He stayed with her on the porch, offering a running commentary on the goings-on of the farm while she finished folding the laundry. He told her about the coyote that sometimes howled at night, the hawk that circled overhead in the afternoons, and the way Mr. Boone could fix anything that was broken through his simple, childish chatter. She began to see a picture of the life they lived here, a life of hard work, solitude, and a quiet, unspoken companionship. Later, she ventured back into the cabin, her self-appointed tasks giving her a sense of purpose. She found the larder was spare but adequate. There was a side of salt pork, sacks of flour and cornmeal, beans, dried apples, and coffee. She stoked the fire in the hearth back to life and set about preparing a meal. Her hands, clumsy at first, soon remembered the familiar rhythms of the kitchen. She sliced the salt pork and set it to sizzle in a heavy cast-iron skillet. She mixed flour, water, and lard, her fingers working the dough for biscuits. The simple, physical work was grounding, the cabin filled with the smells of frying meat, baking bread, and brewing coffee, the smells of a home. Boone returned as the sun climbed higher in the sky. He came from the creek, leading a chestnut mare, his stride long and unhurried. He stopped by the water trough, letting the horse drink, and it was from there that he saw her, a silhouette moving in the warm light of his cabin's doorway. He stood motionless for a full minute, watching. He saw the swept porch, the neatly stacked pile of laundry. He heard the sizzle of the skillet and smelled the unfamiliar scent of biscuits baking. His house, which had only ever been a shelter, a place to eat and sleep, had subtly changed. Something had shifted in the air. He tied the horse to the rail and came up the steps, his tread heavy on the wood. He paused at the door, filling the frame. She turned from the hearth, a smudge of flour on her cheek, her hands coated in dough. Their eyes met for a long moment. He looked past her, his gaze taking in the quiet industry that had transformed his living space. He moved to the wash basin, pumping fresh water and scrubbing his hands with a block of coarse soap. It was then that she saw it, a long, angry scrape across the back of his right hand, the knuckles raw and beaded with blood. It must have happened during their fall down the embankment. He had taken the brunt of the impact, shielding her, and this was the price. Without a word, she dried her own hands on a rag, found a strip of clean cloth in the laundry basket, and approached him as he was drying his hands. He stopped, watching her, his expression unreadable. She gestured toward his injured hand. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something surprised reluctance in his eyes. Then, he slowly, deliberately, held his hand out to her. It was a profound act of trust. She took his hand gently. His skin was rough, calloused, the hand of a man who wrestled a living from the hard earth. Hers, by contrast, felt small and frail. She dipped a corner of the cloth in the clean water and carefully, tenderly, began to clean the wound. He didn't flinch or pull away. He simply stood there, a mountain of a man, allowing this small, near-silent woman to tend to him. She worked with a quiet, focused concentration, her touch light and sure. When the scrape was clean, she wrapped the white cloth around his knuckles, tying it off with a neat, practical knot. Her task finished, she let go of his hand. He looked down at the bandage, then back up at her. His throat worked as if he were about to speak, but no words came. Instead, he gave her the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture that conveyed more than a torrent of words ever could. It was acknowledgement. It was acceptance. It was, in its own way, thanks. They ate at the table, the three of them. Jesse chattered happily about Henrietta the chicken, his voice a bright thread in the tapestry of their shared silence. Boone ate with a slow, steady focus, but the girl saw his eyes drift to the swept porch, to the neatly tied bandage on his hand. She, in turn, felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. For the first time since she had started running, the frantic, hunted feeling had receded. here, in this simple cabin, performing these simple tasks. She felt something she had almost forgotten, a sense of peace. No one said thank you for the swept porch. No one said thank you for the folded laundry or the hot meal. No one said thank you for the mended hand. The words were not necessary. The gratitude existed in the quiet spaces between them, in the shared glances, in the simple, profound acts of doing for one another. It was a new language, one she was only just beginning to learn, but it was spoken here with more truth than any pretty words she had ever heard. The sun set, painting the valley in hues of orange and purple, and the single night she had begged for bled quietly into the next. The single night she had begged for bled into a second, and then a third. A quiet, unspoken rhythm began to establish itself in the small, sun-drenched valley. Time was no longer marked by the frantic ticking of a clock or the imminent threat of discovery, but by the movement of the sun across the sky. Mornings began with the smell of wood smoke and coffee, the lowing of the 2 milk cows in the barn, and the cheerful, nonsensical chatter of Jesse as he followed Boone on his morning chores. The days were filled with the steady, grounding work of survival. The nights were deep and silent, wrapped in a blanket of stars so thick and close it felt as if you could reach up and touch them. Ellie, as she had quietly told Jesse her name was, found her place in this rhythm not through invitation, but through instinct. She was a river, finding its natural course. She rose before the sun, stoking the embers in the hearth back to life. She learned the quirks of the old wood stove, the exact spot on the hearth that was best for rising bread dough. She learned that Boone drank his coffee black and strong, and that Jesse, if allowed, would put 3 spoonfuls of precious sugar in his milk. She mended the tear in Jesse's overalls with small, neat stitches, patched a worn elbow on one of Boone's shirts, and learned to churn butter in a way that produced a sweet, clean flavor. These tasks were her anchor. With each chore completed, she felt a piece of herself being stitched back together. The fear that had been her constant companion for so long was still there, a sleeping beast in the back of her mind. But its claws were no longer constantly piercing her heart. Here, in this isolated pocket of the world, there was only the work of the day. There was no one to please, no one to placate, no one to fear. Boone accepted her presence with the same quiet stoicism with which he accepted the changing seasons. He never told her what to do, yet he seemed to notice everything she did. After she began tending the small, neglected vegetable patch behind the cabin, coaxing new life from the thirsty soil, a new, sharp-bladed hoe appeared on the porch one morning, its handle smooth and freshly oiled. When he saw her struggling to carry 2 heavy buckets of water from the well, he spent the next day digging a shallow trench, diverting a small stream from the creek to run closer to the house. He never mentioned these things. There was no, "I saw you needed this." There was only the deed itself, and she, in turn, never said, "Thank you for your help." Her thanks were in the hot meal waiting for him at dusk, in the way she made sure the water basin was always full, in the clean, folded laundry she left at the foot of his cot while he slept on the floor by the fire, a place he had taken without discussion on her first night. Their communication was a silent ballet of action and reaction, of need and provision. The evenings were the quietest time. After Jesse was tucked into his small bed in a curtained-off corner of the cabin, the silence in the room would deepen. Sometimes Boone would sit at the table, cleaning a rifle or mending a piece of tack, the scrape of his knife or the pull of his thread the only sound. Ellie would sit in the other chair, darning socks by the firelight. They could sit like that for an hour, wrapped in a shared solitude that was not lonely, but comfortable. It was on one such evening, a week after her arrival, that the past came for her. It wasn't in the form of hoofbeats or shouting men, but as a quiet, insidious whisper in her own mind. They were washing the supper dishes in a basin of hot water on the table. It had become their habit. She would wash, and he would take the plates and cups from her, drying them with a rough flour sack cloth. The fire crackled. casting their shadows large and dancing on the log walls. Outside, a coyote yelped, its call a thin, lonely sound against the vastness of the plains. The simple, domestic act of washing dishes together, the warmth of the water, the quiet companionship, it was so far removed from the life she had just escaped that the contrast was a physical blow. A memory, sharp and unwanted, pierced the fragile peace she had built. She saw a different kitchen, a dirty, chaotic one behind a noisy saloon. She remembered the leering face of the man who owned it, the man her father had. Her hands stilled in the soapy water. The tin plate she was holding slipped from her grasp, clattering back into the basin with a dull thud. A single, hot tear escaped her eye and slid down her cheek, tracing a clean path through a smudge of wood ash. Boone stopped wiping the cup he was holding. He didn't look at her, but she felt his stillness, his sudden, focused attention. He waited. She hadn't meant to speak. She had locked her past away in a dark room in her mind and thrown away the key. But in the safety of this quiet cabin, with this silent man beside her, the lock gave way. The words came out in a low, trembling rush, a torrent of pain she had held back for too long. "My father," she began, her voice rough with unshed tears. "He wasn't a kind man. After my mother passed, he saw me as just another mouth to feed, another burden on his back." She scrubbed at the plate in the water, her knuckles white, her gaze fixed on the suds. He had debts, card games and whiskey. He owed a lot of money to a man in town, a man named Silas. The name hung in the air, cold and ugly. It was the name she had heard on the train. Boone's hands, which had been holding the cloth, tightened almost imperceptibly. Silas owned the saloon. She continued, her voice barely a whisper. He wasn't a good man. He looked at me, and he saw something he wanted to own, like a new horse or a bottle of fine liquor. My father saw a way to clear his slate. They called it a marriage, an arrangement. He told me I was to be Silas's wife. She finally looked up from the water, her eyes pleading with Boone to understand, to see the ugliness she could not fully articulate. It wasn't a marriage. It was a transaction. I was the payment for my father's debts. Silas made it clear what he expected of me, what my duties would be. He wanted me there in the saloon. He thought a new, young wife would be good for business. He said my life was his now. The story tumbled out, fragmented and raw. She spoke of the fear, the suffocating sense of being trapped, of her future being a cage she could not escape. She told him of the night she had finally run, taking nothing but the small cloth sack and the clothes on her back, climbing out her window while the sounds of drunken laughter rose from the saloon below. When she finished, a heavy silence fell over the room, deeper than before. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the ragged, quiet sobs that she could no longer hold back. She kept her head down, ashamed of her tears, ashamed of the sordid stories she had brought into this clean, quiet home. She waited for his judgment, for a sign of disgust or pity. She waited for him to move away, to break the fragile connection they had formed. Boone did not move away. He stood beside her, a solid, unshakable presence. He finished drying the cup in his hand, his movements as slow and deliberate as always. He took the wet plate from her trembling fingers and dried it with the same methodical care. He dried the forks, the basin, the skillet. He worked until there was nothing left to dry. Her tears had subsided to a quiet, occasional sniffle. She stood with her hands still in the now cooling water, feeling empty and raw. Boone folded the dishcloth, once, then twice, making a neat, warm square. He didn't speak. He didn't offer a single word of comfort or condemnation. Instead, he reached out and gently, so gently it was almost a question, took her right hand out of the water. He placed the warm, dry, folded cloth over her cold, wet fingers, then closed her own hand over it, his large, calloused hand momentarily covering hers. The touch was brief, lasting only a second, but it sent a shockwave of warmth through her entire body. It was an act of profound, unspoken tenderness. It said, "I have heard you." It said, "Your story does not change anything." It said, "You are not dirty. You are safe." He let go and turned, moving to the hearth to bank the fire for the night, his movements as economical and deliberate as ever, as if nothing had happened. But everything had happened. A great weight had been lifted from her soul, and in its place, something new and fragile had begun to grow. The next morning, the air felt different. It was lighter. Ellie felt lighter. She went down to the creek to fetch fresh mint for tea, and on the bank, half hidden under a cluster of ferns, she saw a single, perfect wildflower. It was a small, 5-petaled blossom of the most delicate blue, a tiny speck of defiant color against the browns and greens of the landscape. It had survived the wind and the harsh sun, a small, resilient thing. She plucked it carefully and carried it back to the cabin. Boone had already left for the day, riding out to check his fences on the far side of the valley. She didn't know what to do with the flower. It felt too personal to put in a jar on the table. Instead, on an impulse, she tucked the stem into a small crack in the log wall of the porch, right next to the door where he would be sure to see it upon his return. It was a silent message, a small offering of beauty in return for the immense kindness he had shown her. He returned at dusk, weary and covered in dust. He walked up the porch steps, and she saw him pause, his eyes falling on the small blue flower. He stopped, his gaze fixed on it for a long moment. He reached out a thick, dirt-smudged finger and touched one of the delicate petals with a surprising gentleness. Then he plucked it from the crack, looked at it for another moment, and entered the cabin without a word. She thought perhaps he had simply discarded it inside. 2 days later, she was mending a tear in the leather pouch he used for his flint and steel. His small, leather-bound ledger, where he kept notes on livestock and supplies, lay on the table. A gust of wind from the open door blew the pages open, and there, pressed carefully between a page listing sacks of feed and the price of nails, was the small blue wildflower. It was flattened, its vibrant color preserved against the paper. He was keeping it. He was saving her silent thank you. Ellie looked at the pressed flower, and a slow, quiet joy bloomed in her chest, as bright and resilient as the blossom itself. No words of love had been spoken. No promises had been made. But in the quiet language of their shared world, in the warmth of a dry cloth on a wet hand and the careful preservation of a single, humble flower, something that felt very much like a promise was being written. The days settled into a cadence, as reliable and steady as the sun's journey across the vast, empty sky. What had begun as a desperate arrangement for a single night's safety had quietly, without announcement or discussion, transformed into something else. It had become life. The change was not marked by a grand event, but by a small, almost imperceptible gesture one morning. Ellie rose, as was her custom, in the pre-dawn chill to stir the fire. She moved to the shelves to get the 3 tin cups they used each day, one large and dented for Boone, one smaller and newer for Jessie, and another, identical to Boone's, which she had claimed for herself. But this morning, there was a 4th cup sitting on the table, placed squarely where she always sat. It was not tin, but a piece of pale, sturdy ceramic, with a small, faded blue cornflower painted on its side. It was old, a woman's cup, and it had not been on the shelves the day before. She stopped, her hand hovering over it. She looked around the quiet cabin. Boone was still outside, the rhythmic thud of his axe splitting firewood, the steady heartbeat of the morning. This cup had not appeared by magic. He must have retrieved it from a trunk or a high shelf, a place where the past was stored. He had taken it out and placed it there for her. It was a silent declaration. It was not a borrowed cup. It was her cup. It said, "You have a place here, A warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the growing fire. And when Boone came inside, his arms laden with wood, she said nothing. She simply filled the ceramic cup with coffee and placed it in his hands, her fingers brushing his for a fleeting second. His eyes met hers over the rim of the cup, and in that shared, silent glance, an entire conversation took place. An agreement was sealed. The boy, Jesse, was the heart of their small, burgeoning world. He was a creature of simple needs and profound observations. He had accepted Ellie's presence with the unquestioning logic of a child who has known little stability and latches onto it when it appears. To him, she was the source of warm biscuits, the mender of torn knees, the soft voice that could sometimes be coaxed into telling a story by the firelight. She was a fixture, as essential and reliable as the sunrise. One afternoon, Jesse was struggling to carry a small bucket of chicken feed, his small arms shaking with the effort. Ellie came up behind him, her hands covering his on the handle. "Here, let me help you with that," she said gently. Together, they carried it to the coop. As they scattered the grain for the squawking, fluttering hens, Jesse stumbled over a loose stone. He didn't fall, but he lurched forward, and the last of the feed spilled in a heap. "Whoa there," Ellie said, steadying him with a hand on his shoulder. He looked up at her, his face flushed with the near mishap, a dusting of grain on his nose. "It's okay, Mama," he said, the words slipping out as naturally and thoughtlessly as a breath. The world seemed to stop for a second. The cackling of the chickens faded to a distant buzz. The word hung in the air between them, bright and fragile and terrifyingly significant. Jesse's eyes widened, his face turning from pink to a deep, embarrassed red. He realized what he had said. He looked down at his boots, suddenly fascinated by a loose lace, his small body rigid with mortification. He expected a correction, a reprimand, a reminder that she was not, in fact, his mother. Ellie's heart gave a painful lurch. The word was a ghost, a promise of a life she had never dared to imagine for herself. It was a title of such immense weight and tenderness. She looked down at the top of his bowed head, at the unruly shock of brown hair, and an emotion so fierce and protective washed over her it almost stole her breath. She knelt in the dirt and chicken scratch, bringing herself to his level. She didn't correct him. She didn't say, "I'm not your mother." To do so would have felt like a cruelty, like snatching a piece of bread from a starving child. Instead, she simply reached out and gently brushed the grain from his nose. "It's all right, Jesse," she whispered, her voice a little thick. "Accidents happen." She spoke of the spilled feed, but they both knew she meant the word. He risked a glance up at her, his brown eyes wide and uncertain, seeing no anger, no rejection in her face, only a soft, sad sort of smile. His rigid posture relaxed. A small, relieved sigh escaped his lips. The moment passed. He did not call her that again, not for a long time, but the word remained. It had been spoken aloud, and now it lived between them, a quiet, acknowledged truth. Their lives became a tapestry woven from two different threads. Her days were spent in and around the cabin. She learned the subtle language of the hens, knowing by their clucks if an egg was laid or a hawk was circling. She mended their clothes with a patient, growing skill, her needle dipping and rising in the firelight. The garden, under her care, began to thrive, offering up tender lettuce and the promise of beans and squash. Her world was one of hearth and home, of creating comfort and sustenance from the raw materials of their isolated life. Boone's world was the land. He was a creature of fences and fields, of sky and livestock. He rode out each day, a solitary figure moving through the vast landscape, checking for breaks in the wire, searching for stray cattle, reading the signs of the earth. He was a man in constant, silent conversation with his environment, and in the afternoons, he would turn his attention to Jesse. He was not a gentle teacher, but he was a patient one. He started Jesse on the old placid mare, his large hand a steady presence on the boy's back. He taught him how to hold the reins, how to sit a horse's walk, how to speak to the animal not with force, but with quiet commands and a confident posture. Ellie would watch them from the porch, her hands busy with snapping beans or shelling peas. She saw the way Boone's hard face would soften almost imperceptibly when Jesse managed a full circuit of the corral without wobbling. She saw the fierce pride in Jesse's small, determined face as he learned. She was watching a father and a son. It didn't matter that they were not bound by blood. They were bound by the shared work of building a life, by the patient transfer of knowledge from one to the other. As the weeks melted into a month, a subtle change became noticeable in both of them. The haunted, hunted look in Ellie's eyes began to recede, replaced by a quiet confidence, and she began to laugh. They were not loud, booming laughs, but soft, breathy sounds, often brought on by Jesse's antics or the comical squabbles of the chickens. The first time it happened, a genuine, unforced laugh at Jesse trying to imitate a rooster's crow. Boone, who was oiling a saddle nearby, went completely still. His hands stopped their work, and he watched her, a look of profound surprise on his face, as if he were hearing a strange and wonderful new bird call for the first time. And Boone began to watch her more. It was never overt, never a stare, but she would be hanging laundry on the line, the breeze catching her hair and pressing the simple calico dress to her form, and she would feel his eyes on her. She would look over to the barn, and he would be there, leaning against a post, ostensibly checking a buckle on a harness. But his attention was fixed on her. His gaze was not possessive or demanding. It was quiet, contemplative, and held a depth of feeling that made her skin tingle. It was the look of a man who had long ago given up on finding anything beautiful in his world and was now faced with an undeniable, unexpected beauty. He was looking at her as if she were the first wildflower of spring after a long, hard winter. Their evenings fell into a comfortable ritual. After Jesse was asleep, and the last of the chores were done, they would find themselves on the porch. The sun would be setting, spilling a palette of fiery orange, deep purple, and soft pink across the sky. The air would grow cool, carrying the scent of dust and sagebrush. They would stand, not sit, side by side, leaning against the porch rail. They rarely spoke during these times. There was no need. The day's work was done. The boy was safe, and the vast, beautiful, and dangerous world was held at bay by the small circle of light spilling from their cabin door. They stood close enough to feel each other's presence, a warmth in the cooling air, but they never touched. A few inches of space always remained between them, a silent acknowledgement of the invisible walls they both carried, built from their separate, painful pasts. But the space was not a chasm. It was a respectful distance, a quiet understanding. They would stand there, shoulder to shoulder, watching the last of the light fade and the first stars appear. In those silent, shared moments, standing together against the encroaching darkness, they were no longer a man, a woman, and a boy. They were a family, an unlikely, unspoken, and fiercely protective family, forged not in a church or before a judge, but in the quiet crucible of the Wild West. The peace of the valley had become so complete, so deeply ingrained in the fabric of their days, that its shattering was all the more brutal. It was a late afternoon in high summer, the air thick with the sweet smell of sun-baked pine and drying grass. Ellie was on her knees in the garden, her hands deep in the dark, cool earth, weeding around a row of promising squash plants. Jesse was nearby, meticulously building a small fortress of twigs and stones, providing a running commentary for an audience of grasshoppers and his own imagination. The world was small, safe, and sun-drenched. Boone was at the corral, replacing a rotted post. The rhythmic thud of his sledgehammer against the wood was a familiar, comforting sound, the steady percussion to the valley's quiet song. He worked with an unhurried, powerful grace, his movements economical and certain. It was a scene of such profound domestic tranquility that it felt as if it had always been and would always be. He was the first to see it. He had paused in his work, leaning on the handle of the sledgehammer to wipe a sleeve across his brow. His gaze, as was its habit, drifted to the mouth of the valley, the narrow gap in the hills that was their only connection to the outside world. It was a barely perceptible change at first, a faint disturbance in the clear air above the horizon. Not a cloud. It was too low, too yellow. It was dust, a plume of it, rising and churning, growing steadily larger. It was the signature of riders, and they were moving fast. Ellie, sensing a change in the rhythm of the afternoon, looked up from her work. The thudding of the hammer had stopped. She saw Boone standing perfectly still, a statue of taut muscle, his entire being focused on that distant, ominous cloud. A cold dread, a long dormant but instantly familiar feeling, began to uncoil in the pit of her stomach. The peaceful spell was broken. Boone turned his head, his eyes finding hers across the yard. The look on his face was one she had never seen before. The quiet weariness was gone, replaced by a cold, hard certainty that chilled her to the bone. He did not shout. His voice was low, but it cut through the air with an authority that was absolute. "Ellie, get the boy. Inside. Now!" There was no room for questions. She scrambled to her feet, wiping her earthy hands on her apron. "Jessie." Her voice was tight with a fear she didn't yet understand, but accepted completely. "Come inside with me, quickly." Jessie, startled by the urgency in her tone, abandoned his fortress and ran to her side, his small face a mask of confusion. She took his hand, his small fingers wrapping tightly around hers, and hurried him toward the cabin. Boone was already moving from the corral, not with panic, but with a long, deliberate stride that seemed to devour the ground. He met them at the porch steps. "Go in. Bar the door. Stay away from the windows," he commanded, his eyes not on them, but locked on the approaching riders, who were now visible as three distinct figures. She pushed Jessie inside ahead of her. The cabin, which moments before had been a sanctuary of warmth and light, now felt like a trap. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she fumbled with the heavy wooden bar, sliding it into its thick iron brackets. The sound of it falling into place was a thunderous, final sound. It shut the world out, but it also locked them in. Through a small crack in the shutter, she watched as Boone stepped back inside, his face a grim, unreadable mask. He didn't look at her or Jessie. He went directly to the stone hearth. Reaching up, he took down the long rifle that rested on two wooden pegs above the mantel. The weapon had been a silent fixture in the room, a part of the cabin's rustic furnishing. Now, in his hands, it was transformed into what it truly was, a tool of death. He checked the action with a series of swift, practiced movements, then reached for the powder horn and shot pouch on the mantel. "Who is it, Mr. Boone?" Jessie asked, his voice a small, trembling whisper. He had seen the rifle. He knew this was more than just unexpected company. Boone didn't answer. He didn't have to. The riders were close enough now for Ellie to see them clearly, and the blood in her veins turned to ice. She recognized the swagger, the cruel set of the shoulders on the man in the lead. It was Silas, and the two men flanking him were the same ones who had boarded the train. They had found her. The beast she had outrun had tracked her to her burrow. They reined in their horses just beyond the garden, their animals snorting and stamping in the sudden stillness. For a long moment, no one moved. The afternoon sun glinted off the barrels of the rifles held loosely in their saddle scabbards. Ledger Silas's voice was a harsh, grating sound that violated the valley's peace. "I know you're in there, and I know you've got something that belongs to me. Send out my wife, and we'll be on our way. No trouble needed." Ellie flinched as if struck. My wife. The words were a brand, a claim of ownership that made her feel sick. She pressed herself back against the wall, pulling Jesse tight against her side. Boone moved to the window next to the door, staying deep in the shadows where he could see out but not be seen. "You've got no business here." "Silas." His voice was a low rumble, steady and devoid of fear. "This is my land. Ride out." A coarse laugh answered him. "Your land? We'll see how much of it you need for a grave. I'm not leaving without what I came for. I paid good money for her." The first shot came without further warning. It wasn't aimed at the window, but at the heavy wooden door. The impact was a deafening crack, and splinters flew inward. Jesse cried out, burying his face in Ellie's dress. Boone didn't even flinch. He raised his own rifle, rested the barrel on the edge of the window frame, and fired. The roar of the gun inside the small cabin was immense, a physical blow of sound and smoke. Outside, one of the men yelped and cursed, clutching at his arm as his horse shied violently. The fight was on. Gunshots echoed through the valley, the peaceful bird song replaced by the crack of rifles and the whine of ricocheting lead. Wood splintered from the cabin walls. A slug punched through a shutter, burying itself in the log wall just inches from Ellie's head. She dragged Jesse to the floor behind the heavy wooden table, her body shielding his as she whispered frantic, useless words of comfort. Boone was a rock in the storm. He moved between the two front windows, never giving them a clear target. His shots measured and deliberate. He wasn't firing wildly. He was making every bullet count. But there were 3 of them, and they were spreading out, trying to catch him in a crossfire. Ellie felt a desperate, suffocating helplessness. She was a liability, a huddling creature waiting for the outcome of a battle being fought over her. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything she could do. Her gaze landed on the hearth, a heavy, cast-iron soup pot filled with water for the evening meal, sat on a hook over the embers. An idea, born of pure, animal desperation, seized her. "Stay down. Jesse," she whispered fiercely. She scrambled on her hands and knees to the hearth. The pot was heavy and hot. Using her apron to protect her hands, she lifted it from its hook. She crawled to the window that Boone had just left. Peeking over the sill, she saw one of Silas's men creeping along the side of the house, trying to get to a blind spot. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she shoved the window shutter open and hurled the pot and its contents with all her might. The man looked up, his eyes wide with surprise, just as the heavy pot and a cascade of scalding water crashed down on him. He screamed, a high, thin sound of shock and pain, dropping his rifle and stumbling back, clawing at his face and chest. But her desperate act had a terrible cost. It had revealed her position, and it had distracted Boone for a fraction of a second. He turned his head at the man's scream, his eyes instinctively flicking to her window. It was the opening Silas had been waiting for. With a roar, he charged the front door, his boot crashing against it. The wood groaned, but the heavy bar held. As Boone turned back, Silas fired his pistol not at Boone, but at the leather hinges of the door. The shots blew the leather apart. The door, no longer secured, crashed inward. Silas burst into the room, a wild, triumphant look on his face. Boone didn't have time to bring his long rifle to bear. He dropped it, pulling the heavy Colt from his hip, but Silas was already on him. He didn't fire. He swung his own pistol like a club, a vicious, brutal arc of steel. The barrel connected with the side of Boone's head with a sickening, wet crunch. Boone's eyes went wide with a moment of stunned surprise, and then they rolled back in his head. He crumpled to the floor without a sound, a heap of limp limbs and unconsciousness. No, Ellie's scream was a raw, ragged tear in the fabric of the world. The third man, his arm bleeding but his gun in hand, came in through the ruined doorway. They stood over Boone's still form, their chests heaving. "Get the girl," Silas snarled, his eyes burning with a hateful fire as he looked at Ellie. But the other man's eyes had found Jesse, who was cowering behind the overturned table. Before Ellie could move or scream, the man lunged, grabbing the boy by the arm and hauling him to his feet. He dragged the terrified, sobbing child into the center of the room and pressed the cold muzzle of his pistol to Jesse's temple. "Don't move a muscle." "Which?" the man hissed at Ellie. "Or the boy gets it." Ellie froze, her entire world narrowing to the sight of that gun against Jesse's head. The boy's face was white with terror, his eyes wide and fixed on her, his small mouth open in a silent plea. Time seemed to slow down, each heartbeat a lifetime. She saw Boone, unmoving on the floor, a dark stain of blood beginning to spread in his hair. She saw Jesse, a pawn in a brutal game, his life hanging by a thread. The men were laughing, confident in their victory. They had the man down, the child hostage, and the woman cornered. They had won. But as she looked at the gun in the man's hand, something inside her shifted. The terror was still there, a cold, shaking sea. But beneath it, something new was rising. It was a rage so pure and hot it burned away the fear. They had come into her sanctuary. They had struck down her protector, and now they were threatening her child. He might not be hers by blood, but in that moment, he was hers by a bond far stronger. Her eyes fell upon the rifle Boone had dropped. It lay on the floorboards, just a few feet from him, its dark wood and long steel barrel seeming to call to her. She had never fired a gun in her life. She had always been afraid of them, of the noise and the violence they represented. But Boone was unconscious. Jesse was about to die. There was no one else. Slowly, her hands trembling so violently she could barely control them, Ellie took a step, then another. She knelt, her knees hitting the rough wood of the floor. Her shaking fingers reached out and closed around the stock of the rifle. It was heavier than she could have imagined, a dead, terrible weight. But as her fingers wrapped around it, a strange, cold calm began to settle over her. She lifted the weapon, the long barrel wavering as she struggled to support its weight, and began to rise. The world was a portrait of violence, frozen for a single, silent heartbeat. Ellie stood, the rifle a monstrous weight in her arms, its long barrel wavering in a frantic, uncontrollable dance. Her knuckles were white, her arms screaming from the strain. The men in the center of the room, who had been gods of chaos just a moment before, turned to look at her. First came surprise, a flicker of disbelief in their eyes. Then, a slow, ugly smile spread across Silas's face. He let out a short, contemptuous laugh. "Well, look at that! Cletus!" he sneered, gesturing with his pistol toward Ellie. "The little mouse grew some teeth. What you gonna do with that, girl? You couldn't hit the barn from the inside." Cletus, the man holding Jesse, chuckled along with his boss, but his eyes were narrower, more watchful. The pistol he held to Jesse's temple didn't waver. "She's shaking like a leaf in a windstorm. Drop it, girl, before you hurt somebody. Namely, this boy here." Every instinct in Ellie's body screamed at her to obey, to let the heavy weapon fall, to curl into a ball and wait for the end. The shaking in her arms traveled through her whole body, a violent tremor that rattled her teeth. Fear was a physical thing, a cold liquid sloshing in her stomach. But then her eyes locked on Jesse's. His face was a pale moon of terror, tears streaming silently down his cheeks, his small body rigid in the man's grasp. He wasn't looking at the gun. He was looking at her. His eyes filled with a desperate, childish faith she had done nothing to earn but could not betray. Her gaze shifted to Boone, a still, broken shape on the floor. The dark patch of blood in his hair was spreading, soaking into the rough wood of the floorboards. He had shielded her. He had taken the blow that was meant, in the end, for her. He had fallen protecting their home. A fire, hotter and stronger than any fear, ignited in her chest. It burned through the shaking, through the doubt. It was a primal, animal rage. My home, my child, my man. The words were not thoughts, but a creed that solidified in her soul. The world outside the cabin ceased to exist. The sun, the sky, the mountains, they were all gone. Her entire universe was contained within those 4 log walls. It consisted of the terrified face of the boy she had come to love, the still form of the man who had saved her, and the 2 monsters who had brought this ruin upon them. "I'm not going to tell you again," Silas said, his voice losing its mocking edge, replaced by a low, dangerous growl. He took a step toward her. "Put it down!" Ellie's trembling hands moved, her clumsy fingers fumbling along the stock, searching for the trigger. She tried to lift the barrel, to align the crude sights with the man holding Jessie, but it was like trying to aim a falling tree. It was in that moment of stretched, unbearable tension that a new sound entered the world. It was a deafening, echoing blast that came from outside the cabin. It was not the crack of a pistol or a rifle, but the deep-throated roar of a shotgun. A spray of lead pellets tore through the upper frame of the shattered doorway, splintering the wood just above Silas's head. Silas and Cletus both flinched violently, spinning around, their eyes wide with shock and alarm. They had been so focused on the enemies within that they had forgotten about the world without. "You boys picked the wrong day to come calling on Boone Ledger," a voice called from the direction of the barn. It was a voice like rocks grinding together, old and weathered and utterly devoid of fear. Framed in the late afternoon light, standing just beyond the porch, was a man who looked as old and tough as the land itself. He was stooped and wiry, his face a roadmap of wrinkles under a sweat-stained hat. He held a double-barreled shotgun, its twin muzzles looking as wide and dark as cave mouths. One barrel was smoking. The other was aimed squarely at Silas's chest. Ellie had seen him once before, a few days ago, riding in from the high country with a string of pack mules. Boone had simply said, "That's Raoul. He keeps an eye on the north pasture." They had exchanged a simple nod, and the old man had disappeared into a small line cabin an hour's ride away. Now, he was here. The balance of power in the room shifted so violently, it was a palpable force. A moment ago, Silas and Cletus had been the predators, savoring their victory. Now, they were trapped. They were caught between a trembling, unpredictable girl with a rifle and a steady old man with a shotgun who looked like he had been born for this very moment. Panic flickered in Cletus's eyes. His attention was now split, darting from Ellie to the new threat outside. His grip on Jessie, which had been cruelly tight, loosened for a fraction of a second. The muzzle of his pistol dipped almost imperceptibly. It was all the opening Ellie needed. She did not think. She did not aim in the traditional sense. The rage and instinct that had been building inside her erupted in a single, convulsive action. She pointed the long, heavy barrel in Cletus's direction, her entire focus on the arm that held Jessie captive. She closed her eyes and pulled the trigger. The explosion was a cataclysm. The rifle kicked back with the force of a mule, the brass butt plate slamming into her shoulder and throwing her backward. A blinding flash of orange light seared her vision even through her closed eyelids. The sound was a physical blow that deafened her, a clap of thunder that shook the very logs of the cabin. She stumbled back, landing hard on the floor, the rifle clattering from her numb fingers. When her vision cleared, the room was thick with a cloud of acrid, gray smoke. Through the haze, she saw Cletus. He was screaming, a high, thin sound of agony, and staring at his right hand. It was a mangled ruin of blood and splintered bone. The pistol lay on the floor at his feet. Jessie was free. The boy, reacting with the pure instinct of a freed animal, scrambled away from his captor, a small, sobbing blur of motion. He ran, not to the door, but to Ellie, crashing into her and burying his face in the folds of her dress, his small body shaking uncontrollably. Silas stared for a half-second at his wounded man, at the old man with the shotgun who was now taking a steady step onto the porch, and at the wild-eyed girl on the floor. He was a bully and a predator, but he was not a fool. The fight was lost. The prize had been snatched from his grasp. "We're leaving," he roared. He grabbed Cletus by his good arm, hauling him toward the door. "This ain't over." Ledger, he screamed at Boone's unconscious form. "And you witch, I'll be back for you." Raoul stood aside, his shotgun still leveled, allowing them to pass. He was not there to exact justice, only to protect the homestead. He watched as Silas half-dragged, half-carried his whimpering man to their horses. They mounted clumsily and spurred their animals into a frantic gallop, disappearing back the way they came, leaving a cloud of dust and a shattered, ringing silence in their wake. The silence inside the cabin was more profound than any noise. It was thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. The smoky air was hard to breathe. For a long moment, Ellie just knelt on the floor, her arms wrapped around Jesse's shaking body, her mind a complete and utter blank. She had done it. She had fired the gun. Jesse was safe. Then, the blankness receded, and the full, horrifying reality of the situation crashed down upon her. The adrenaline that had sustained her, that had given her the strength of a cornered animal, vanished as if a plug had been pulled. An immense, bone-deep weariness washed over her. The rifle on the floor suddenly looked alien and terrible. Her arms felt like lead. Her legs would no longer hold her. Her gaze shifted from Jesse to Boone. He had not moved. He lay in the exact same position, a fallen giant amidst the debris of their violated home. "Boone," she whispered, her voice a dry, cracking sound. She gently pushed Jesse aside and crawled on her hands and knees across the floor, the rough wood scraping her skin. She reached his side, her trembling hand hovering over his still face. He was so pale beneath his tan and the grime of the fight. The blood in his hair was dark and matted. She touched his cheek. It was still warm, but he was so still. The terror that she had held at bay, the fear for her own life, was nothing compared to the cold, paralyzing dread that now seized her. To have found this sanctuary, this quiet man, this fragile peace, only to have it ripped away, it was a cruelty beyond measure. Tears she hadn't known she was holding back began to fall, hot and fast, splashing onto his dusty shirt. She leaned down, her lips close to his ear, the world narrowing to this one, unmoving man. "Boone," she sobbed, the words torn from the deepest part of her soul. You can't leave us. Don't you leave me." She rested her forehead against his chest, her body shaking with silent, ragged sobs, listening for a heartbeat, for a breath, for anything. There was only silence, a dead, empty silence that was the sound of her world ending. And then, beneath her ear, so faint she thought she might have imagined it, she felt a slight, deep rumble. It was followed by a sound, a low, guttural groan of pain. Her head snapped up. She stared at his face, her breath catching in her throat. His eyelids fluttered. A muscle in his jaw twitched. Another groan, stronger this time, escaped his lips. He was alive. A sound that was half a laugh and half a sob burst from her. He was broken and bleeding and unconscious, but he was alive. The spark was still there. And for Ellie, who had just walked through the deepest pit of hell, that tiny, flickering spark was as bright and brilliant as the sun. The immediate aftermath of the violence was a landscape of surreal, ringing silence. Through the haze of gun smoke, Raoul stepped over the threshold of the ruined doorway, his old shotgun held loosely in the crook of his arm. His weathered face was grim, his eyes taking in the scene with a practiced, unflinching gaze, the splintered wood, the overturned table, the still form of Boone on the floor, and Ellie, a statue of shock, kneeling beside him with the boy clutched to her side. Breathing Raoul's voice was gravel, a sound that seemed to pull Ellie back from the precipice of hysteria. She nodded dumbly, unable to form words, one hand resting on the faint rise and fall of Boone's chest. "All right then." The old man's voice was devoid of panic. He had seen worse. Work to do. Can't leave him on the floor. His words were the catalyst that broke her paralysis, with a surge of purpose that felt like coming up for air. Ellie gently moved Jessie aside.
Jessie, honey, I need you to go sit by the fire. Can you do that for me? Be very still and quiet.
The boy, his eyes huge and dark in his pale face, nodded and scuttled to the hearth, curling into a small ball on the bearskin rug, his gaze fixed on Boone. Together, Ellie and Raoul moved him. It was a clumsy, agonizing process. Boone was a dead weight, a mountain of a man, and every slight jostle drew a low groan from his unconscious lips. They managed to get him to his cot, the one Ellie had been using, his long legs hanging over the end. His head lolled to the side, and the full extent of the wound became horribly clear. The skin was broken, the hair matted with a dark, sticky combination of blood and dirt. Raoul brought a bucket of water and a bottle of whiskey from the shelf. "This'll burn," he stated, pouring a generous amount of the liquor onto a clean rag. "But it's better than the fever that'll come if you don't." Ellie took the rag, her hand still trembling but her resolve hardening into a shield. As Raoul stood guard by the door, watching the mouth of the valley, she began the slow, terrible task of cleaning the wound. With every gentle dab, she flinched, imagining his pain. She washed away the blood, revealing a deep, ugly gash along his temple. But the skull, as far as she could tell, was not broken. He had been lucky, or unlucky, depending on how you measured it. The hours that followed blurred into a long, nightmarish vigil. Raoul, having ascertained that no immediate pursuit was coming, methodically repaired the door hinge with strips of leather from the barn and helped her right the furniture. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his presence a gruff, grounding comfort. He brought in fresh water and firewood, checked on the livestock, and then, with a simple, "Keep a cool cloth on his head," he retreated, leaving them to the quiet of the cabin. He would be their sentinel, their guardian on the perimeter. Night fell, and the cabin became a small, flickering island of light in an ocean of darkness. Ellie lit a single lantern, keeping the flame low. The world shrank to the narrow cot and the man who lay upon it. His breathing was shallow, sometimes rattling in his chest. A fever began to set in, a dry, consuming heat that radiated from his skin. She spent the night in the chair beside him, her entire being focused on the simple, vital tasks of care. She bathed his face and neck with cool water, her touch as light as a moth's wing. She dribbled water between his cracked lips, hoping he would swallow. She listened to every breath, every rustle of the blanket, her own exhaustion a distant, unimportant ache. Jessie had not moved from the hearth. He had eventually fallen into a fitful sleep on the rug, his small body curled tightly, one hand still clutching the little wooden horse Boone had carved for him. Even in sleep, he was a part of the vigil, a small, steadfast anchor in the corner of the room. The next day was the same, and the day after, time lost its meaning, measured not in hours, but in the slow drip of water from a cloth, the simmering of a thin broth on the fire, the changing quality of the light through the window. The cabin was a sealed world of hushed sounds. Ellie spoke only in whispers to Jessie, who in turn had become almost completely silent. He did not play. He found a piece of charcoal and a few spare sheets of brown wrapping paper and lay on his stomach on the floor. Drawing. He drew the barn. He drew his favorite cow. He drew Henrietta the chicken. But mostly, he drew a tall man in a wide-brimmed hat, sometimes on a horse, sometimes standing on the porch. He never drew the man lying down. The drawings were his prayers, his attempts to redraw the world back to the way it was supposed to be. He would finish one, then crawl over to the cot and hold it up, as if for Boone's silent inspection, before starting on another. Ellie fell into the rhythm of a healer. She forced herself to eat the broth she made for Boone, knowing she needed strength. She learned the landscape of his unconsciousness. She knew the low moan that meant a spike of pain, the restless twitch of his fingers that preceded a wave of fever. She talked to him, her voice a low, constant murmur. She told him about her day, About the way Jessie's drawing of the horse was getting better. About the small green tomatoes she'd found in the garden. She filled the silence with the sound of her voice, weaving a thread of normalcy through the fabric of their crisis, hoping it might somehow reach him in the darkness where he lay. On the fourth day, the fever broke. She awoke in the chair to find his forehead cool and damp with sweat, his breathing deeper, more regular. A fragile, terrifying hope began to take root in her heart. He was fighting. He was coming back. The fifth day was quiet. A deep, healing stillness had settled over the cabin. Jessie, seemingly sensing the shift, had taken his charcoal and paper outside onto the porch, his scratching the only sound to break the afternoon peace. The door was ajar, and a warm, lazy beam of sunlight cut across the room, illuminating the dust motes in a golden shaft. Ellie sat in the chair by the cot, one of Boone's few books open in her lap. It was a worn copy of Shakespeare, its pages soft with use. She wasn't really reading, just looking at the words, finding a strange comfort in their order and permanence. She began to read aloud, her voice barely a whisper, not for him, but for herself, for the simple act of creating a peaceful sound in the quiet room. "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day," she murmured, her finger tracing the line. "Thou art more lovely and more temperate." A floorboard creaked behind her. She thought it was Jessie and didn't look up. She continued, her voice soft and even. "Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. You're still here." The voice was a dry, rasping whisper, so faint she thought she had imagined it, a ghost of a sound from the depths of her own weary mind. Her heart stopped. The book slipped from her lap, falling to the floor with a soft thud. Slowly, she lifted her head. Boone's eyes were open. They were cloudy, unfocused, but they were open, and they were fixed on her. She stared, unable to breathe, unable to move. It was as if she were seeing a miracle. The dark, unreadable depths she had first seen on the train were now filled with a raw, vulnerable confusion. He looked at her, his brows furrowed in a pained effort to make sense of the world. He tried to speak again, his lips barely moving. "Figured you'd have run." The words, so weak, so broken, struck her with the force of a physical blow. Of all the things he could have said, "What happened? Where am I?" he had asked about her. His first coherent thought, rising from the depths of his injury, was the fear that she would be gone, that the violence and the chaos had finally sent her running, just as she had been running when he first found her. He believed she was a creature of flight, and that he had only given her another reason to flee. A sound, a choked sob that was equal parts laughter and agony, escaped her throat. The fragile dam of control she had maintained for 5 days and 5 nights shattered completely. Tears welled in her eyes and began to stream down her face, hot and unstoppable. They were not tears of sadness, but of a relief so profound it was painful. She leaned forward, her hands hovering over him, afraid to touch him, afraid this was a dream from which she would wake. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. She shook her head, the movement of fierce, absolute denial of his fear. "I'm not running anymore. This is home." A flicker of something understanding, relief, a deep, soul-shaking weariness passed through his eyes. A long, shuddering breath escaped him. His eyes slid shut again, not in unconsciousness, but in a profound, healing exhaustion. He had his answer. He could rest. The days that followed were quiet, slow, and steeped in a new kind of intimacy. He drifted in and out of a drowsy, peaceful state. Ellie continued to care for him, but now her actions were met with a flicker of awareness. When she fed him broth, his eyes would open and follow the movement of the spoon. When she bathed his face, he would lean into the touch of the cool cloth. Jessie, hearing that Boone was awake, was a constant, joyful presence. He brought his drawings and laid them on the blanket, explaining each one in a proud, serious whisper. Boone would watch him, a faint, tired smile touching his lips, his eyes conveying a deep, fatherly affection that needed no words. On the third day after his awakening, he was strong enough to sit up for a few minutes, propped against a pile of pillows. Ellie was sitting on the edge of the cot, changing the bandage on his head. Her fingers were deft and gentle, her touch a familiar comfort. He was watching her face, his gaze intent, as if seeing her for the first time. When she was finished, she started to pull away, but his hand, slow and a little unsteady, came up and caught hers. His fingers, rough and calloused, closed around her smaller, softer ones. It was not a grip of desperation or need, but a simple, profound act of connection. She looked at their joined hands, his large and weathered, hers small and capable, and her breath caught in her throat. He said nothing. He just held her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it in a slow, rhythmic pattern. They sat like that for a long time as the afternoon light slanted through the window, painting the cabin in shades of gold. No words were spoken, none were needed. The terror of the past, the uncertainty of the future, it all faded away, leaving only the simple, undeniable truth of the present moment. His touch was a silent vow. Her acceptance was a silent answer. In the quiet of the healing room, holding hands, they were simply Boone and Ellie, and that was more than enough. The scar on Boone's temple faded from an angry red to a pale, silver line, a permanent testament to the day their peace was bought with violence. Summer ripened and softened, its fierce heat giving way to the golden, hazy afternoons of early autumn. The valley breathed a long, slow sigh of relief. The world outside, with its grasping men and forgotten debts, felt a universe away. Boone's strength returned in slow, steady increments the first time he walked, unassisted, from the cot to the porch, leaning heavily on the door frame. Ellie had felt a surge of triumph so fierce it was almost painful. Jessie had cheered, a small, loud clap of pure joy. Soon, Boone was spending his days in a chair on the porch, his hands, at first clumsy and weak, busy with small tasks, sharpening a knife, mending a bridle, and carving a new, more detailed horse for Jessie, its legs more refined, its head held a little higher. He was a man reacquainting himself with his own body, with his own life. He was quieter than ever, but his silence had changed. It was no longer the solitary, walled-off quiet of a man alone. It was a watchful, listening quiet. His eyes followed Ellie as she moved through her daily routines, a soft, wondering expression on his face. He watched her hang laundry, her movements a simple, graceful dance against the vast blue sky. He watched her in the garden, her hands covered in earth, her face smudged with dirt, and a slow, almost imperceptible smile would touch his lips. He was a man who had built a fortress around his heart, and he was now watching, in quiet awe, as a wildflower grew through its very foundations. Ellie, too, had been irrevocably altered. The ghost of the hunted girl was gone, banished by the thunderous roar of a rifle and the fierce, primal need to protect her own. A new stillness had settled deep inside her. She was no longer a guest, a refugee living on borrowed time. When she swept the porch or kneaded bread, her hands moved with a sense of ownership. This was her home, earned not just through care and labor, but through blood and courage. The fear of being found had been replaced by the fierce, quiet conviction that she would never run again. Her hair remained her last link to the past. Every morning, she would brush it out, and then, with practiced, methodical motions, plait it into the same long, thick braid. It was a habit born of a life on the run, a way to keep things neat, controlled, and out of the way. The braid was a symbol of readiness, of a girl who might need to flee into the darkness at a moment's notice. It was the armor of the person she used to be. One evening, the air was cool and carried the scent of wood smoke and distant rain. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the western sky in strokes of apricot and rose. Boone was on the porch, his back against a post, sanding the last rough edges from Jesse's new horse. The boy himself was in the tall grass of the meadow beyond the corral, a small, joyful figure chasing after grasshoppers, his laughter carrying on the still air. Ellie came out of the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron. She had finished the supper dishes, and the quiet hour had arrived, the time when the day's work was done and the world held its breath. She walked to the porch railing and stood beside Boone, a familiar, comfortable position they had taken up nearly every evening. They stood in silence, watching the light change, watching the boy play. The moment felt different. It was imbued with a sense of peace so deep and profound it felt like a destination they had finally reached after a long and brutal journey. The ghosts were gone. The valley was theirs. Slowly, without looking at him, Ellie lifted her hands to the nape of her neck. Her fingers found the worn leather tie that held the end of her braid. It was a movement Boone had never seen. He stopped his sanding, his hands going still, the small wooden horse resting in his lap. He watched her, his gaze intent, a silent question in his eyes. With a soft pull, the tie came loose. Her fingers, sure and deliberate, began to unwork the plait. She separated the 3 thick strands of hair, her movements unhurried, almost ceremonial. For years, this braid had been her shield. Undoing it felt like laying down a weapon after a long war. The hair fell. It came loose in a slow, shimmering cascade, catching the last golden rays of the setting sun, released from its tight confines. It seemed to come alive, a river of honey and wheat that tumbled over her shoulders and down her back, soft and unruly. It softened the lines of her face, framed her in a way that was vulnerable, open and breathtakingly beautiful. The breeze caught a few loose strands, lifting them like silken threads. Boone's guard, the one he had painstakingly built over years of solitude and loss, finally, completely, fell. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as the frightened girl from the train, or the capable woman who ran his home, or the fierce defender who had stood her ground. He saw Ellie, luminous and whole in the fading light. He set the wooden horse aside. He reached out, his calloused, scarred hand moving with a reverence that was almost painful to watch. He did not touch her hair. Instead, he laid his hand gently on her shoulder. The touch was warm, solid, and grounding. It was a silent acknowledgement of the immense significance of her simple act. It said, "I see you. I understand." She leaned into his touch ever so slightly, a quiet acceptance. For a long moment, they stood like that as the sky deepened to purple behind the mountains. Then, her voice so soft it was almost a part of the evening breeze, she spoke. "At first," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the distant, laughing form of Jesse, "all I wanted was to hide under your coat." The words brought him back to the rattling dark of the freight car, to the trembling girl who had begged for a sliver of darkness to conceal her. It felt like a lifetime ago. He had offered her a shield then, but so much had changed. His voice was a low, rough rumble, stripped of everything but a raw, gentle sincerity. And now, she turned her head, her eyes, clear and shining, meeting his. There was no fear in them anymore. There was no shadow of the past. There was only a quiet, unwavering truth. "Now," she said, and a slow, beautiful smile bloomed on her face. "Now, I just want to stand beside you. No more hiding." The unspoken vows hung in the air between them, more real and binding than any words spoken before a preacher. He had offered her sanctuary, and she, in turn, was offering him her heart. He was no longer just her protector. She was no longer just his ward. They were partners, equals, survivors who had found in each other the one thing they had both stopped looking for a place to belong. He took his hand from her shoulder, and as she turned fully toward him, his hand found hers. their fingers interlaced. A natural, perfect fit. It was not a gesture of passion, but of a deep, quiet rightness. It felt like coming home. Together, they stepped off the porch and onto the cool, dusty earth of the yard. They began to walk, not toward any particular destination, but simply forward, together, ahead of them. Jesse, seeing them approach, let out a whoop of delight and ran through a patch of late-blooming wildflowers, his small hands batting at the yellow and white blossoms. The sun dipped below the jagged line of the mountains, setting their world on fire for a final, glorious moment. Its light was behind them, casting their long shadows ahead, but they were not looking back. In their eyes, as they walked hand in hand toward the laughing boy, there was only the beginning of a silent, steadfast love, as rugged and as beautiful as the wild land that had forged it. Thank you for listening. If this story touched your heart, please let us know where in the world you're listening from in the comments below. We'd love to share our thoughts together. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, like this video, and give it a little extra support by hitting the hype button to help more people hear this tale.